having me today. I'm really excited to get to share. I just want to thank Crystal and Notori and the rest of BSU for actually asking me to speak on Black History Month and to share a little bit with you on why I celebrate Black History Month and what that means to me. As a white woman, obviously, it might mean something different than to others, but I want to share with you why it's important. And I want to share with you today a little bit about my own journey and some of the phases that I've gone through in my life as I think about seeing other people and hearing diverse stories. I'm from Orange County. I was raised in Costa Mesa, and kind of grew up in a middle-class family. So as I was growing up, I went to high school locally. I went to high school at Costa Mesa High, just up the street. And I got exposed a little bit more to sort of diverse populations and started realizing that people had different experiences than I did. And that context and perspective really matter. That our experience in the world varies. So as a psychologist, I know this. When people first come in to see me, I do a thing called an intake. And an intake is getting your history and your background. So I'm gonna ask you a bunch of questions to learn about your individual story. That's incredibly important. Individual story and perspective, because it shapes who we are. And the reason that we look at history is to understand kind of where people are going. It's not to dwell in the past, but it really informs where we move to. And so it's helpful to have that context and that perspective. I think beyond just the individual story, it's also important to look at groups and systems. So I want to hear the individual person's story, but I also want to understand how groups move through society and time, so a little bit more of a sociological lens. I think all of these things are incredibly important. And as I look at Jesus, I actually find that he did this. He looked at perspective and context. He spoke to the culture that people were in, their own history, their own background, and he didn't just focus from his lens or his experience. So it's something that I really try to do. And as I think about Black history, I realize that as I've heard individual stories, and as I've looked at the Black community as a whole, I am completely enriched by that. I am a better person because of the stories that I've heard. I'm a better person because I listen to the history of the Black community. It's something that's made me better. So I just want you to have that in the back of your mind as I sort of share today about 3 different phases in my own life and things that I've experienced. In grad school, first phase here, in grad school, I worked at a Native American high school. Some of you in my classes have heard this, so I apologize if you know a little bit about this already. But I worked at a Native American high school for a couple years. This is a boarding school, and so people would come from all around the country from a variety of tribes, and they would live on campus and they would take classes. And I would come in and I would do therapy. Now, you can imagine the challenge of this just initially. I'm coming in from the outside in order to do therapy. About half the people at this school lived on reservations before they came to the school. And about half the people lived in like urban environments and then would come to our school. So when I would go in, I was confronted frequently with being different. Many of the students would look at me and actually say, "I do not trust you." It was actually kind of nice that they would tell me that directly instead of me trying to figure out what was going on, but several times directly to my face, "I do not trust you. You are white. I don't want to share with you." And we had to work through that. And it was really interesting because I heard several stories about white people took my land. And some of the things that people were sharing, these deep pains and deep hurts. And I'm going to be honest with you, I was really tempted to defend myself. I was really tempted in those moments to say, that wasn't me. Right? I wasn't the one that took your land. I wasn't the one over there. That wasn't me. But as I thought about it, defense wasn't the right answer. Inherently, defense is building walls, right? When we defend, we put up blockades and we put up barriers that stop relationship. That's what defense is. If you think about sort of fortresses and you think about castles and all these things, what do they have? Moat, don't come in, right? Drawbridge, boundary, barrier, wall, high walls. That's defense. And if you think about this emotionally, sometimes that's what we do. We defend. And so as I thought about it, I realized my job in that moment wasn't to defend. It was actually to invite. So even though that wasn't me, I wasn't the one who had done that, I was sitting in a moment representing a lot of deep pain for people. And what I wanted to do was invite them to share that with me. Invite them to tell their story. Instead of defend, I want us to learn how to invite. This, by the way, is not an easy thing. It's not an easy thing to do. When I look at how Jesus functioned, I realize he wasn't defending himself all that often. He would defend others. Sometimes people would come in and say something about his disciples or about why did that person do this or why did they take care of you, and he would defend them. But he didn't have to defend himself so much. He told a story, and he listened maybe to where they were, their deep heart, what was going on inside of them, because he invited relationship. He connected with people. He didn't need to defend himself from whatever it was. And you know why? I think it's because he was secure in that he was the Son of God. Who needs to defend that? I am. It's so fascinating to me when I look at us as Christians, because we are sons and daughters of God too. We don't need to defend ourselves. We have the security in being God's loved and beloved. Isn't that amazing? Somehow I think that we can be really insecure and somebody comes up against us and maybe they have a different view or a different opinion, a different idea, a different experience, and we start to fight that. Let me defend why I believe this or what this position is. But we don't have to. We're actually called to invite. Come on in, I want to hear your story. I want to know who you are. Let me tell you why I'm secure. Academia is kind of an interesting thing because we encourage intellectual debate, right? I'm all for critical thinking. I think this is a good thing. I like debate. There's certain things in my classes that I'm like, I want to hear your perspective, and there's no right answer. Let's just figure it out. But we encourage this right or wrong dialogue. Defend your position and your belief. Tell me why you stand in that position. Tell me why you believe that. This is good. We need to do this because we need to understand where we're coming from. But sometimes when we carry out that intellectual debate into relationships, defense. It's blocking the things that we can do. Let me read this to you real quickly. Ephesians 2:14. For he himself is our peace, who has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility. So when I start to defend myself, I'm putting back up that barrier, and I'm putting back up that wall that blocks us from what Christ wants us to do, which is relate to each other. He's taken that barrier down. 1 Peter 3:8. Finally, all of you, be like-minded, be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble. Part of not defending ourselves is humility. I can walk and hear someone else's story. I can walk alongside them, right? I can listen, and I don't have to stand up and say, this is my position, this is who I am. Now, I think it's good to be known. I think that's important. And sometimes we have to defend the people around us and stand up for ourselves. I'm not talking about something that's abusive or overwhelming. That's just my little psychology caveat there. But I'm talking about us being able to be humble and not always have to be right, not always have to force our position. And I really, really learned that at this school. Because as I allowed myself to just step back and invite, I learned so much. Oh my gosh, these students taught me so much. I loved them. I learned so much about myself. I learned so much about the world as I listened to their story, but that never would have happened if I would have come in with, that wasn't me. Why are you saying that about me? What have I done to not have your trust? I didn't need to do that. So not defending, but inviting. The second phase, not long after I worked at that high school, I went to work in LA. And I worked in a neighborhood that was primarily Hispanic, low income, and one of the highest gang populations. Very, very dense with different gangs in this area. So I went in there to work at another school It was a school where people who had dropped out of high school would come back and they'd get their GEDs or they'd get their high school diploma. Technically, you weren't supposed to be part of a gang anymore to be part of this school. But if you know much about that, it's pretty hard to actually leave a gang. So a lot of people were former gang members, a few kind of active gang members who were trying to kind of get out, and then several people who had just grown up in that neighborhood. And so it was a very different worldview. I sometimes like to joke about this because growing up here, you know what your food options are, right? When I was there at the center, I would go to In-N-Out and I would go to Panda Express to get lunch if I went off-site to get food. And it was so funny to me because I would come back and the students would tell me, man, you go to the really expensive places to eat. And I was just like, the expensive places? Panda Express and In-N-Out? That doesn't seem so pricey to me. But it helped me to understand that actually everything else around there was Burger King and McDonald's and Taco Bell. Not that there's anything wrong with those, right? But I would usually go to the sort of pricier place. Shifted my world to think about that. Here in Orange County, that's not the inexpensive place. Or that's not the expensive place, right? It's kind of the inexpensive places. So I started to realize they had different experiences than I did as I was working with them. But what was really interesting is I had learned how to not defend. So again, I was confronted with very similar things, like, you don't know my reality. Who are you to come into my world? And the reality is I didn't know it all. So I wanted to hear their story. Something fascinating happened as I did that. I actually started to see myself in them. I'm gonna come back to that in just a second. I just want you to have some context here. As I listened to the stories of the students there, I realized they had never experienced a moment of peace. Never. Most of these people would tell me that even at their house, they couldn't relax or rest because they were so afraid that somebody would come and attack them, retaliation or something. People like the police, they weren't to be trusted because they were coming after them constantly. There was actually literally no moment in which they could rest. And when I was working with them in the center at the school, you could kind of see them on edge, but I remember one time very clearly, we went down to the street on a break, and I was standing with this one student who I just loved. He was so bright, so clever, but he was one that was still sort of stuck in this world. And he would stand on the street just like this, scanning. His eyes would just be back and forth, scanning, scanning, scanning. So even though he was sort of staring at me, his eyes were just going like this. He was looking for threats in the environment. I grew up here. Honestly, I've unfortunately, don't tell too many people this, I have left my keys in my door at night. Like my front door, I've done that once or twice. I'm not that worried about it. I'm like, oops, big deal. I know, you guys are like, really? It's happened. I used to live just a block from here, and I'd walk back and forth to Vanguard and to my house even at night, and I was fine. And here was this kid in the middle of the day scanning the environment. I didn't know what that was like. It was really fascinating to see. A couple weeks after that, he actually went on a vacation, and he went out of town for a week. And most people don't get to go out of town very often, but he was able to really leave the area, and he told me it was the first time he had ever felt peace in his life. But it took him 3 days to calm down, 3 days before he could even feel somewhat safe. So these were the kinds of stories that I started to hear and understand, and I realized that fear and survival are incredible motivators. And quite frankly, if I was in that position and if I had grown up in that environment, I'd probably be making the exact same decisions as that kid. I saw myself in him. It's so easy to come from the outside and sort of judge, like, what are you doing? How did you get involved in that? Why are you making those decisions? But as I listened to him, I thought I would be making that same decision. And what I think is so important is for us to step back sometimes and recognize ourselves in others. People who might be a little different, people who have a different experience. So as we learn not to defend and invite in, we can also see ourselves in other people and recognize who they are and how that reflects back in us. So I kind of went through these experiences here with the Native American high school, to working in LA, to then kind of coming here to Vanguard and working. And so about a year ago, a little over a year ago, lots of things were going on in the media around the experience of Black Americans. And we obviously had Black Lives Matter and a lot of things going on around the country, protests and things. And I decided that it was really important for me to start to understand the experience of the Black community a little bit more. I'm not Black. I'll never be Black. I'm not going to actually fully understand that at any point. but I thought I wanted to open myself up just a little bit more to kind of get perspective. So in December of 2014, I was flying out to Nashville to visit a friend, and I called her up and I just said, hey, is there any sort of rally or something that's going on for Black Lives Matter that I can participate in? And she said, absolutely. So I flew out, I got there in an evening, immediately got picked up at the airport and driven straight to downtown Nashville for this rally. This rally was a march around town, and it was hosted by the police station. And when I say hosted by the police station, I mean literally they fed us food and gave us drink. They set up the tables for us. As we marched through the city, they cleared all the paths for us, and were really, really patient. I'm going to tell you about that police chief in just a second. But I went there, and I marched along the city, and this is quite an experience. I don't know if anybody's been to Nashville, but downtown Nashville is lots of bars and lots of clubs, and it was like a Friday night, and people were out, and we'd be marching, and there'd be people bringing out their phones, like taking pictures and watching all the protests. They'd be coming out of the buildings. We marched down through the residential areas, and we marched down by stores, and there were just people that constantly gathered and came out to look at us. Just to be clear, there was no violence at any point in time in this whole thing. It was very, very peaceful. And I walked through, and as I did this, I heard the stories of people next to me. And it was amazing to me, because I actually got a different perspective. I was listening as we were walking together about some of the experiences that they had had and some of the challenges that they had faced, and it helped me to start getting a different perspective. I don't know if you are familiar much with some of these protests, but actually part of it was they were doing die-ins at the time. A die-in is where you would lay on the ground and kind of protest over people being killed. So I laid on the ground in this intersection. It was cold. I'm on the concrete. I feel so incredibly vulnerable laying there. I'm just like, okay, first emotionally, I'm feeling like this is kind of embarrassing. Like, what's going on? People are gonna look at me. What are they gonna think? Like, I feel so uncomfortable. I feel so silly laying here. And then I thought about how so many other people feel vulnerable on a daily basis and feel exposed on a daily basis, not just emotionally, but physically feel threatened. To lay there is pretty vulnerable physically, too. Somebody can come to you. And I think it just started to help me understand the vulnerability that sometimes people feel and sometimes people face. And I put myself in that uncomfortable position just to get a different perspective. So we did this whole thing, and one of the really interesting things about Nashville is they have this police chief who's a white, middle-aged man. He was getting a lot of feedback about, you shouldn't let this happen. Why are these protests happening? And he wrote this amazing letter to the community, and I just want to read a portion of it to you. As imperfect humans, we have a tendency to limit our association with other persons to those persons who are most like us. Unfortunately, there is even more of a human tendency to stay within our comfort zone by further narrowing those associations to persons who share our thoughts and opinions. By doing this, we can avoid giving consideration to thoughts and ideas different than our own. This would make us uncomfortable. By considering only the thoughts and ideas we are in agreement with, we stay in our comfort zone. Our own biases get reinforced and reflected back at us, leaving no room for any opinion but our own. By doing this, we often convince ourselves that the majority of the world shares opinion and that anyone with another opinion is obviously wrong. It is only when we go outside our comfort zone and subject ourselves to the discomfort of considering thoughts we don't agree with that we can make an informed judgment on any matter. We can still disagree and maintain our opinions, but we can now do so knowing that the issue has been given consideration from all sides. Only if we truly give fair consideration to all points of view, we may need to swallow our pride and amend our original thoughts. I loved what he had to say because the third thing I learned in this experience was to step outside my comfort zone, to experience other people's perspectives. So as I've gone through this journey, I've learned several things, not to defend, but to invite, to see myself in the other, and to get uncomfortable, because I want to see other people's perspectives. Again, who knows where we'll land? Maybe we need to make adjustments in our thought. Maybe we end up at the same place. Psalm 133:1 says, "How good and pleasant it is when God's people live together in unity." I think it's only when we sort of set down some of our own barriers and listen to other people that we really live in unity. And that's why this month is exciting to me, because I get to hear something I haven't experienced. I learn something about pain and beauty, trial and triumph, as I hear the stories of the Black community. So that's my hope for you. As you guys go out today, I want Vanguard to be a place of unity, where we hear each other's stories, where we don't feel the need to defend, where we're willing to get a little bit uncomfortable and to see ourselves in other people, and that people will point to this place and say, wow, they have something different because they love each other, because they care about each other. So that is my hope for you, and I'm just gonna close this out in a prayer and then send you off, okay? Lord God, I thank you for the beauty in each of us. I thank you that we can learn from each other. I thank you that we need each other to get a fuller picture of who you are. I just pray today that you would lower our defenses, give us humility, give us the ears to listen to each other, to manage ourselves, and to know that we are your children and to walk in that security. So we thank you, Lord, and we just pray over this community right now that we would be united in you. I pray a blessing upon the students as they go out. In your name, amen. Thank you.
At Vanguard University, your story matters. Where will it take you next? For more information, please visit vanguard.edu.